What's going on, everyone? CryptoVatsik here with another technical analysis video for you. Today I'm going to be covering RSR reserve rights. If you enjoy this content, I would really appreciate it if you smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. As always, nothing of what you're about to see is considered financial advice and they're just my opinions. Okay guys, let's get into the chart. So looking at reserve rights, there is still some work to do before we really get that momentum behind this thing. You'll notice that we had a very classic altcoin bottom here where we had a capitulation event with this V shape here, and then ultimately this rounding off bottom. This was still a substantial drop from our V shape down to the true bottom, about a minus 65%-ish drop from that low, but then ultimately coming into our accumulation in yellow, which was really that final flattening in price before we ultimately made our market structure break and moved towards the upside. So I do think in the coming weeks we could really see this thing take off. As I said, we do have that macro market structure break at this point in the green rectangle here, as all of these prior lower highs were essentially, to me, just the bear market still, until now we have clearly broken that bearish cycle, printing what looks to be 7 green candles, weekly candles in a row, and coming up to my first level of interest, which is basically from all of these highs that we put in here. And I think also it is a low from back here in 2020. So it's kind of my first level of interest that I'm really watching and would expect price to at least potentially stall out at for some consolidation before we push up to my next level, which is a bit of an SR. You can see clearly from up here, not that far above it. Coming up to the 100 EMA clearly here as well on high time frame. This is the weekly. So might see some consolidation here, but we have had a major push this week. Okay, this has been a major buyback after we had this nasty wick. We had 2 nasty wicks 2 weeks ago, and then the prior week we had this massive nasty wick, and all of that liquidity just getting scooped up and continuing the push. And we will go into the daily time frame in a moment as well. But just looking at this, we've clearly got our capitulation over here, the V-shape temporary reversal, and then ultimately that time capitulation, right? That capitulation over time of basically boredom. But if you take a look at the volume, let's take a look at the volume and zoom out a little bit. Where do you see the majority of that volume coming in? Arguably all throughout here, which is ultimately our bear market, as you can see. Now, I don't think there's a ton of new capital ever since, midway through 2022 that has now entered the market miraculously in comparison to back here. So what this tells me is that accumulators are taking advantage of the discount prices, and they scooped up RSR at all of these lows and potentially holding it for the long term. And that's what I see when I see something like that, when you clearly look at this chart and the liquidity and the capital is not flowing in during this cycle, but rather the boredom stage, we call it. So just something to keep in mind, something interesting, that this one might be heavily accumulated for the longer term. But just coming back to the chart now, so if we look at this, we've got those 2 points of interest in the dotted horizontal lines here that I've noted. We are coming up to the 100 EMA, as I said, the thin gray line here, exponential moving average. So I wouldn't be surprised to see, some sort of consolidation within this range and, ultimately following this curved band towards our macro resistance up here. This to me is going to be our first real major area of resistance. It's obviously a pretty large focal point with this consolidation until it broke to the upside, but ultimately it was our 3 pushes down bottom here that we had back in 2021 until ultimately it was lost and then became that resistance zone. So for me, that's what I'm really looking at. I think, above that, there's definitely some areas to look at as, either targets or those temporary resistance levels. But for me, I talk about those bear market ceilings all the time. I really want to see assets get out of those bear market ceilings, and I think that RSR might be a little late to the punch, but it is getting there. And I think once we're able to really surpass these 2 highs of interest here, then I think it's off to the races, to be honest. So I've marked out the 618 here as well on the current leg. Okay, so from the origin of the leg to the assumption that it stalls out here at this high of interest, and it might not. This weekly candle could still come all the way up to that second level of interest, in which case we'll just be taking our fib to that high, giving us, a reference to work with as to where a possible retracement location would be. But I don't want to get ahead of myself just yet. With this major push, I kind of expected price would be a little bit weaker at this point, considering, relative strength in the market. And I had marked out our macro market structure break here in green, which is essentially just the final lower high from all these lower highs right here, which has now been broken with a fresh higher high. So officially breaking out of that bear market cycle and into the long-term bull market. So I was looking at that level, naturally naturally those are areas of, typical retrace or typical retest. So I'm not going to say it's out of the question. I think even if we did come up here and chop around, we could get a wick down to that level still before reclaiming and then off to red. It's definitely still possible. So I'm not going to take it off the chart. I'm going to leave it on there as a point of reference. But the chart looks really good, to be honest. I think, like I said, I could see us taking a path on the way up of this curve band, either exponentially or potentially, if we do get that consolidation following something like that, ultimately flipping these points of interest and, kind of chopping around in it until really expanding up to our macro resistance, as I said. So, structurally, I think looking at this really tells me it's going to be a healthy chart for the long term. This is really the beginning stage of a bull market, at least looking at this chart, RSR. Things really are just getting started on this one. We've just come out of our literal bottom accumulation. We've had our capitulation, we've had our time capitulation, and we have now just printed a first higher high. So yes, there's lots of other altcoins right now that have been doing relatively much better, and that's fine. I don't believe in saying that every single one will have its time to shine, because that's not true. Not everything will pump, but RSR I think is a strong asset that will, and it's not like it hasn't done that well. Realistically off the bottom, it's still up 3 or 4x here, so still doing really well, to be honest. So as I said, a couple of areas of interest in here on the high time frame coming up to the 100 EMA, a couple levels down here to be wary of in green and the 618. Let's flip to the daily time frame now and drill into this a little bit further. Okay, so as you can see, a massive bullish move here recently on today's candle. I had marked out this range. It's clearly breaking out of that range at this point with this pierce here. But we had a very obvious range to work with previously, actually, when we were trading somewhere down here, I think near the EQ, a clear high, a clear swing low. And, typically my strategy is to look for that reclaim of the equilibrium as a sign of continuation breakout of the range high. But in this case, we've obviously just expedited that process, finally getting some volatility. We had this slow grind up here with price kind of tightening and pinching in this channel until ultimately an impulsive leg to the upside. Finally, some volatility, a good sell-off forming that range, and now looks to be pushing outside of the range high. So I think there's a couple things to consider here when you see a chart like this. We've marked out our high time frame on the weekly, those highs of interest that I had looked at. So despite the strength in RSR right now, it doesn't mean that I throw those levels out the window and I just assume we're coming straight up to red. So yeah, right now I am looking at this level here, which is at 008. And then otherwise, if we are able to flip that and clearly break this range high, then sure, yeah, I'll look for a swing up to our next level up here at 1 cent, or I think just over 1 cent. But even thereafter, like I said, we could get a rejection and get some sort of, longer term correction from that point, coming back down potentially within this range again. I'm not so certain that we're going to come all the way down to the 618 and down to green. Like I said, it's not off the table, but I'm not leaning towards that. But what I'm ultimately looking at is our macro resistance. Okay, so whatever happens in here in the meantime, I am ultimately looking for that push up to red for a much larger, I think, correction or form of consolidation before really taking off to towards the all-time highs and potentially beyond. The one thing I would be wary of is this being a deviation outside of the range high and us waking up tomorrow to be trading back inside of the upper 50th percentile of this range, because then ultimately this would just be that deviation and then we're just range bound still within these parameters, which would be fine because, I think price is still healthy, the structure is still bullish. So it'd give us more of an opportunity to either look at entering around the range EQ or potentially somewhere lower down towards this candle here and down towards that low. I don't think we get the range low again, but potentially a deeper push towards the higher low here. That's if we stall out and this does become a deviation pierce above the range high. The other thing to note is we've got a highs trend here. Okay, so we got three ascending highs here. So, a bit of a diagonal resistance there going on. Typically these will either continue to reject price and, really just suppress it in this kind of overall massive channel, or the contrary to that, in a very bullish environment, price can often just flip it and then it becomes its support level. So, it really could go either way at this point. Clearly relative strength is good on this one right now. So time will tell. I don't think anything to do over the next few hours or even potentially until tomorrow, really reevaluating this in the morning. It's been a massive push off off of the low. So if you're able to catch this low, congratulations, nice job. You know, oftentimes I say you need to wait for confirmation of that range low. So when we put in this high here, you'd be seeing price continuously chop down, lower high, and then boom, you'd get it right here. Our last lower high broken by a higher high, very short retest, and all these wicks down here, down to demand here, about 4 equal lows there. So this being ultimately that opportunity to identify a trend reversal. But I must say I wouldn't have expected it to be at the range high already. This is really fast. So perhaps that accumulation is starting to pay off. As I said, with that volume, you start looking at the volume. We know where has the money been flowing into, or when has that money been flowing in? Well, it's been flowing in pretty much since we made our bottom until now, which is about 680 days of accumulation, or just under that if you don't count, you know, this leg that we've recently got, because truthfully the bottom accumulation really is right in here, that flatlining time capitulation here in yellow. But arguably, if you're looking long term on this one, I would argue that really anything in this zone is still accumulation if you're looking long term. But anyways, guys, I don't think there's too much more to report on this one. I hope you took something away from this video, and if you did, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for future updates, and we'll catch y'all next time. Peace.